Well, good evening. I'm Scott Harris, Executive Director of Museums for the University of Mary Washington. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this James Monroe Museum lecture back in Monroe Hall. We always feel it's very appropriate to be in Monroe Hall when we do programs outside of the museum. And after some renovation over the last couple of years, we're glad to be back in our namesake building here. We are very grateful to the Friends of the James Monroe Museum as being supporters of a lot of what we do, including our public programs. And if you are interested in becoming a member of the Friends, I don't recall if we've got our membership brochures up there. We should, or you can go to our website, jamesmonroemuseum.umw.edu, and you'll find a link there that would take you to the giving page. And we do appreciate that support. I want to remind you, we've got our program schedule, which I feel like we just printed now. We're almost down to the bottom of it for 2025. So we are closing out. After tonight's lecture, we have two really great programs coming up in November. And again, at our website, you can find out about these or on social media. But on November 12th, we continue a long a collaboration with the James Farmer Multicultural Center here at UMW. And the program during Native American History Month is Diplomacy and Displacement, the Monroe Doctrine, and Indigenous Cultures. Now, we have looked at the Monroe Doctrine in just about every possible way and through every possible lens over the years, but what we have not done is look at a striking part of interpretation of what the impact of the Monroe Doctrine was, not on foreign powers, where it was principally aimed, but on sovereign Indian nations in terms of where the federal government policy was and how it would evolve in the years during and after the Monroe administration. In fact, there are a number of developments that occurred during Monroe's presidency that affected Indian relations with Native American indigenous tribes that would have larger implications later. The Civilization Fund Act was passed in 1819 by Congress, which, among other things, would lead to the creation of boarding schools, which had a very problematic legacy going into the 20th century. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was formed during the administration of James Monroe and put in the War Department, which tells you a little bit about what the thinking was. So there are aspects to that and to the impact of the Monroe Doctrine that we'll discuss at this program on November 12th. Jason Sellers from our own history faculty here at UMW will take part in that. Dr. David Wilkins from University of Richmond, Rose Powhatan, who was a noted Native American activist and author and storyteller here in Virginia, and then Zach Thomas is the moderator, and Zach is a UMW student himself, Native American, and a particularly skilled and knowledgeable person about Native American history and culture, and he's the president of our Native American Student Association here at the university. So it's going to be a really insightful program. That is on November 12th, 6 o'clock p.m. That will be in the colonnade room of the Cedric Rucker University Center. So not this building, but the building over there off of College Avenue. And on November 20th, we are going to conclude 8 years of commemorating the bicentennial of the presidency of James Monroe. It all started back in 2016, when we look back at the election of 1816 that brought Monroe into office. And then over the last 8 years, we have done all sorts of different programs. We have reenacted his inauguration out front of this building on a very cold day in January. March. We have had all manner of living history discussions. We've had traveling exhibits go around the country, tracing Monroe's tours. During the pandemic, when we had to go all virtual, we had a variety of different programs with people from all over the country, including Dr. Lynn Cheney, who spoke about the Virginia dynasty and Monroe's role in that, and made sure we stayed on time because she had a swordfish in the oven, and we had to be sure she got back to that from her living room to her kitchen. So it's been all sorts of different things, but we will on November 20th at the 38th Annual James Monroe Lecture have the presidential legacy of James Monroe. And we will discuss both what the impacts were of his administration and then what came after, particularly with the succession of John Quincy Adams from him, and then what subsequent developments might occur. And Bob Karachuk, who is the editor and project director of the Papers of James Monroe, will be part of that. And Lindsay Chervinsky, a presidential historian and author who's currently the director of the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon, a previous speaker of ours who was virtual back in the COVID days, so we're going to be glad to welcome her in person. And I'll be moderating that, and we'll be talking about this legacy of the Monroe presidency, and that will be right back in here at 7 o'clock on November 20th. So we do invite you to that. As I say, our website, social media can tell you about all these things. Well, we're very pleased to welcome to our stage tonight Alan Pell Crawford. We were talking just before, and actually some number of years ago, he was a lecturer in our Great Lives series. So it's not his first time on the campus, and we're glad to have him back. Alan is an American author, historian, and journalist whose work illuminates the personal and political complexities of America's founding generations. With deep expertise in 18th and early 19th century political history, he has produced narrative-driven biographies and historical studies of figures such as Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Adams. Crawford's writing combines scholarly rigor with accessible storytelling. His essays and commentary have appeared in major outlets including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Smithsonian Magazine, where he brings historical insight to contemporary issues. Among his notable works is This Fierce People, a revisionist account of the American Revolution that explores how the Founding Fathers evolved in response to events on the ground, rethinking their notions of leadership and governance, and that's what we'll be hearing about tonight. And this year, This Fierce People was honored with the American Battlefield Trust Prize for History, selected from among dozens of nominated titles across 15 publishing houses. The $50,000 award recognizes Crawford's outstanding contribution to both historical scholarship and the preservation of America's formative landscapes. He will formally accept the award and deliver remarks at the inaugural Battlefield Book Fest to be held November 13th through 15th, 2025 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Appropriate both for the organization and the timing, since that's very close to the Gettysburg Address time. It's an event that we warmly encourage you to attend, and I also ask you to warmly welcome to Monroe Hall, Alan Pell Crawford.
Thank you, Scott. I just drove up this afternoon from Richmond, and instead of going 95, I went Route 1. And I'm amazed I made it here in time because as I've made that windy road, there were, I kept wanting to stop because of the historical markers. There was Patrick Henry, there's Yellow Tavern, Scotchtown, Lewis and Clark, Lee and Grant, Scottsville, Stonewall Jackson death site. There was one of Lafayette and Cornwallis, and I kept wanting to stop, but of course I couldn't. It reminded me why I love living in this area. We moved from Washington to Richmond in '93, I believe, and I've absolutely loved it. Now, in terms of travels, my wife and I got back from 2 weeks in France about a week ago. And I'm doing, based on that trip, where we went from Marseille to France, to Paris, I'm writing a travel article for Virginia Living magazine in which I discuss where the stops we made coincided with ones Thomas Jefferson made in 1787. We went from Marseille to Paris, he went from Paris to Marseille, but we went to the same places. One is in Nîmes, which was the Maison Carrée Roman temple that Jefferson used for the model for the Virginia State Capitol. A lot has changed, obviously, in France since Jefferson was there, it would be interesting to imagine his response to the Opera House in Paris. Notre Dame was there, of course, completed in 1345, and when I got home, I was looking up some of this stuff. Jefferson was at Notre Dame, and he attended with John and Abigail Adams a celebration of the birth of a son to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And it was an occasion, he said, that bids defiance of description. He said there were more dignitaries in attendance than General Washington had of simple soldiers when he routed the British at Trenton. The French Opera House in Versailles and some of these places reminds me of a response of a very close friend of mine who had come to this country from Russia in the 1980s and had seen all the great palaces of dignitaries in Russia. And he and his wife wanted to see Tuckahoe Plantation, so Jefferson's boyhood home. So I took them out there, and he took one look at this simple farmhouse, and he said, "So this is your American aristocracy." I've written on Jefferson, I've written on the Randolphs, I've written now on the American Revolution, and at this rate, by the time I get to Monroe, I will be 137 years old. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about the Revolutionary War that I had when I wrote this book, and I wrote it in large part to clear up some of the questions the mistaken ideas, and answer some of the questions that I was having as I began to read about the war. Because in most standard accounts, it's a pretty straightforward story. It begins in December of 1773. You've got the Boston Tea Party. Then there's Lexington and Concord. Then there's Bunker Hill. Then Washington crosses the Delaware with Monroe in the boat. Then there's Brandywine and Saratoga and Germantown, and then Valley Forge. And then after Valley Forge, there's Yorktown. But what I couldn't figure out as I was reading all this stuff was that the last major battle in the North was at Monmouth. And that was in June of 1778. The British didn't surrender at Yorktown until October 1781. So a lot of time passes between Monmouth and Yorktown. It's more like something like 3 years. So what was I missing? Something else must have happened during that time that actually convinced the British to surrender. And if what happened during that time was included at all in standard histories, it would be confined to a single chapter toward the end, almost as an afterthought. There might be a few pages back there called The Southern Campaign. And about the only accounts of that Southern Campaign that I could find are in books for specialists, often from obscure presses with limited distribution. What puzzled me, too, was that Washington, as monumental a figure as he was in the war, was actually in the North the whole time. He was in New York and New Jersey, and he crossed the Potomac only when Cornwallis had already taken his position at Yorktown, and the French admiral told him that he could not keep his ships off the Virginia coast forever, and if Washington was to come south, he needed to do so now. Now, I want to make it clear, and I'll do so in greater detail in a moment, is that in no way am I denigrating Washington's role in the war. For reasons I'll get to shortly, my regard for the man actually increased the more I learned, and for reasons that I don't think are given sufficient attention. So trying to figure all this out, I read books often not from distinguished academics, but from what struck me for the most part as hobbyists. Some of that information is in biographies, of course, and in firsthand accounts in memoirs like Light Horse Harry Lees and Bannister Tarleton's. Now, there are reasons the Southern campaign is generally overlooked, especially these days. And we can speculate about those. I'm happy to do so maybe when the time comes for questions. But for my purposes, it occurred to me that the standard histories leave out some of the great battles and some of the great characters in the war. They also do not sufficiently convey the extent to which the war in the Carolinas, in Virginia and Georgia, was a civil war of almost unfathomable ferocity. Readers routinely tell me this shocked them. And why not? It shocked Nathanael Greene. In December of 1780, just weeks after Washington appointed Greene as head of the Continental Army in the South, Greene wrote to Samuel Huntington, president of the Continental Congress, that in the Southern backcountry, supporters of independence and opponents of it, and I quote, pursue each other with as much relentless fury as beasts of prey. Men and boys who had not enlisted in the war are frequently murdered as they ride along the road, Greene said, and great numbers of Tories are waylaying the roads, waiting for unsuspecting victims to appear. Greene told Alexander Hamilton, then an aide-de-camp to Washington, that the division among the people is much greater than I imagined. The Whigs and Tories persecute each other with little less than savage fury. There's nothing but murders and devastations in every quarter. Greene said it was almost impossible to feed his army because the whole country is in great degree laid waste. And the spirit of plundering made the challenge even more daunting. Civil government had almost completely broken down, and indulge me while I quote here from my own splendid prose, the ravages of war were obvious almost everywhere you looked. Towns that had been bustling with business before the war had been reduced to smoking ruins. Bridges over the rivers that cut through the countryside had been demolished, preventing armies from crossing from one side to the other, but also made it impossible for fleeing civilians to do so. On farms, fences had been torn down to be used as firewood, and horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs that had once been confined had been taken away by passing armies or slaughtered on the spot. Fields lay fallow, and farms produced little food. The owners whose farms still operated either found their corn, wheat, cattle, or hogs taken by passing troops or paid for with worthless promissory notes. On plantations, slaves who worked the fields had either gone over to the British or otherwise wandered off. Farmhouses, also commandeered by passing armies, had been plundered of their furnishings or sometimes burned, just as churches had been. Neighbors who had been friends and sometimes in-laws were now at war with one another. Widows and fatherless children wandered on country lanes carrying their few belongings with them. Sickness and disease, rampant among the soldiers and on prison ships, quickly spread to civilians. Commerce had come to a standstill. Inflation was rampant and currencies had lost their value. The Continental Congress, what there was of a national government, was effectively bankrupt, getting by on loans from France, as dependent on this foreign government for money as the army was for supplies. In Virginia, and I love this, Virginia was having a terrible time getting men to enlist because the state was running low on liquor. In an effort to save grain, the Virginia General Assembly cut the customary ration of 1/4 of a pint of liquor a man per day, and enlistments fell. Some armaments were being produced at ironworks and carried by wagon into the Carolinas, but Benedict Arnold, when he captured Richmond in December of 1780, put a stop to that, destroying foundries, supply houses, and mills. Benedict Arnold, let's not forget, was an American. In significant ways, the war in the South was, as mentioned, a civil war. The British, deciding in late 1778 to take the war to the South, were banking on the likelihood that it would be a civil war. When the war in the North had reached a stalemate, the British took the war to the South in the belief, not without reason, that large numbers of loyalists in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia would fight the war for them. And there was something to that strategy. We often forget the extent to which it involved Americans fighting other Americans. At Kings Mountain in October of 1780, the only man in the battle who was not an American was Patrick Ferguson, a Scotsman who commanded an army of loyalists. These loyalists, taking a position on the mountaintop, faced a makeshift force that came to be known as the Over-Mountain Men, men who had crossed the Appalachians from what is today Kentucky and Tennessee. These Over-Mountain Men, who were not part of Washington's Continental Army or part of state militias, proceeded to whip the Loyalists at Kings Mountain and then went back home. Ferguson, who had informed Cornwallis that there was no way this swarm of backwoodsmen, as Tarleton called them, could beat him. But they did. Ferguson, who was killed at Kings Mountain, had discovered something that other British commanders would discover, something that made all the difference. They will not fight like gentlemen, whined a British officer with the wonderfully posh name of John Watson Tadwell Watson. They fight like savages, eternally firing and whooping around us by night and day, waylaying and popping at us from behind every tree. Now, I said a few moments ago something that called into question whether or not this was or was not George Washington's war, as a title of a standard and pretty good history of the war calls it. And while I had to conclude that in one sense this was not, after all, George Washington's war, in another sense it really was. While it is true that until Yorktown, Washington did not lead troops in the Southern campaign, he did something in some ways even more impressive than that, especially considering the apparent odds against an American victory over what was at that time the most powerful army in the world. Now, it's tempting to draw some pretty simple-minded leadership lessons from Washington's conduct of the war. It's tempting because there's much explanatory power in it. Early in the war, Washington told John Hancock, who was then president of the Continental Congress, that for officers in the Continental Army, Washington wanted men much like himself who were well established, prosperous, and, as he put it, activated by principles of honor. Put differently, Washington wanted men who were already leaders in the community with reputations to uphold. Otherwise, Washington said, you have little to expect of them. Washington had professional soldiers, men who were well-trained and well-disciplined. He not only had no confidence in what we would call guerrilla fighters, men like Francis Marion, he had disdain for them. As the war dragged on, however, Washington would come to rely on what we would call self-made men, men such as Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan. He saw what they could do, and his own understanding of leadership evolved. When Washington chose Greene to replace Horatio Gates as commander of the Southern Army, he was able to offer Greene little or no guidance on how to prosecute the war. And what is for me the great moment in this whole book, Washington admitted it. Here's what he told Greene. Uninformed as I am of the enemy's force in that quarter, meaning the South, of our own or the resources which it will be in our power to command for carrying on the war, Washington told Greene, I can give you no particular instructions, but must leave it to you to govern yourself entirely according to your own prudence and judgment and the circumstances in which you find yourself. Washington was well aware, he said, that the nature of the command will offer you embarrassments of a singular and complicated nature. But I rely upon your abilities and exertions for everything your means will enable you to effect. Washington would not presume, in today's parlance, to micromanage the war in the South. It would be up to Greene and his own officers and the men like Morgan to figure out how to win the war in the South or not. If a strategy was to develop, they would have to determine what it would be and give it form. Washington had the good sense to delegate authority, again drawing on the language of a later day, when the situation required it. And Greene and Morgan and Francis Marion and Light Horse Harry Lee and the others accepted the challenge. Now, about Daniel Morgan, nobody even knows for sure where he was born or when. By Morgan's own account, he left home at 17, New Jersey claims him, and headed south. He had almost no education. He drove wagons for more prosperous farmers. He also drove wagons for General Edward Braddock in his expedition against the French, and there he met George Washington. It was when he joined a militia company fighting in Canada that Morgan found his true calling. And more than that, Washington saw such promise in this rough character to make sure Morgan got his own command, and an unconventional one it was. Washington prevailed upon Hancock to give Morgan his own special corps of 500 men who would operate independently. They would even have their own uniform, if uniform is a proper word for what it was they were to wear. It occurs to me, Washington told Hancock, that if you were to dress a company or two of true woodsmen in the right Indian style and let them make the attack accompanied with screaming and yelling, as the Indians do, it would have very good consequences. Washington also made sure Morgan's men were equipped with scalping knives. Morgan and his men, as an independent company, but also as regulars, acquitted themselves admirably at Saratoga and in the action around Monmouth, and later on at Cowpens in South Carolina, where Morgan would prove to be a remarkable commander of men and a surprisingly astute tactician. Washington's ability to spot talent and to give talented men the authority to act on their own judgment reminds me of the orders that Benjamin Cleveland, one of the commanders of North Carolina troops at Kings Mountain, gave his men. "My brave fellows," Cleveland told his troops, "we have beat the Tories and we can beat them again. They are all cowards. If they had the spirit of men, they would join their fellow citizens in supporting the independence of their country. When you are engaged," Cleveland said, "you are not to wait for the command from me. I will show you by example how to fight. I can undertake no more. Every man must consider himself an officer and act from his own judgment." Without pushing the point too far here, I would venture to say that there's something peculiarly American in what Washington and Cleveland told their men, and in this country's understanding of leadership itself. It would be an exaggeration, of course, to argue that it was this understanding of leadership alone that made it possible for the supporters of independence to win the war, but it is not a stretch to say it played a large part. You see it over and over again in the war in the South, in which troops, sometimes with little training and sometimes no official connection whatever to the Continental Army itself, manages against horrendous odds to defeat larger and better equipped, better trained forces. Over and over, the supporters of independence under the command of self-made men managed to turn their weaknesses into strengths and prevail. I'm thinking again of Daniel Morgan when in January of 1781, he faced Tarleton at Cowpens. Great numbers of Morgan's men had never faced enemy fire or, scarier still, British bayonets. So he placed the least experienced men in a line far in front of two other lines of battle-hardened troops. And the night before the battle, Morgan went from campfire to campfire, telling these raw troops what would be expected of them come morning. They would take their position, and Tarleton would charge. And they were to fire their weapons, and then they could leave the field. Tarleton would think they were fleeing, that he had routed the enemy and charge ahead, not knowing he would be charging right into the guns of the second line of more experienced soldiers, more or less concealed behind a ridge. Long after I had laid down, one of the men recalled, Morgan was going among the soldiers, encouraging them and telling them that he was going to crack his whip over Tarleton in the morning as sure as they lived. But for that to happen, Morgan said he would count on them to do their part, and he would ask only what he knew they were capable of doing. They were not expected to hold their position at all costs. They were to stand their ground until the redcoats were within 50 paces of their line, then fire once, twice, if possible 3 times, and then fall back. Morning came, as one of the soldiers recalled, Tarleton's men came on like a thunderstorm, as if certain of victory. When they had come within 50 yards of Morgan's first line, this soldier said, it was pop, 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 and then the whole volley. It seemed like one sheet of flame from right to left. More redcoats fell than anyone could have imagined, and before long, once they had engaged with the second line, as well as those concealed in the woods behind them, they immediately took themselves to flight. The same soldier recalled, and they appeared to be as hard to stop as a drove of wild Choctaw steers. Cowpens, like Kings Mountain, was a great victory for the supporters of independence, leading to victory at Yorktown, and then the also too easily forgotten skirmishing that went on in the South for 2 more years after that. Now, we like to think of the Revolutionary War as a time when great patriotic leaders emerged, and that is true, many did. We're accustomed to look with reverence at Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, for example, but their contemporaries did not. Henry and Jefferson were both regarded as disastrous wartime governors who failed miserably to protect Virginia from the enemy and adequately equip their own soldiers. The state was able to supply weapons for only 1 in 3 or 4 of its militiamen. And at one point in the war, Virginia refused to accept its own paper money for payment of taxes. When Jefferson's term as governor ended, the legislature named Thomas Nelson to replace him, Nelson, who had been a major general earlier in the war. Nelson was a soldier, which Jefferson was not, and he was given near dictatorial power as governor, which Jefferson never sought. Jefferson, having done as best he could in impossible circumstances, then packed his family off to Poplar Forest. His political enemies found his departure from Richmond and subsequent movements a rich source of amusement. A sister-in-law of John Marshall's could not contain her amusement. Such terror and confusion you have no idea of, she wrote. Governor, council, everybody scampering. Nothing, she said, is more laughable than the accounts we have of our illustrious governor, who they say took neither rest nor food nor for man or horse till he reached Monticello. That is unfair, but it gives us some sense of the reverence with which Jefferson's contemporaries viewed his performance as wartime governor, and again helps us see that period of our nation's founding with greater clarity. Jefferson's reputation has not improved in recent years, which brings us to the whole sorry subject of slavery and the role it played in the American Revolution, especially, of course, in the South. This is an endlessly rich subject, and it is getting a good deal of attention these days for understandable reasons. I mentioned earlier why the Southern campaign is given short shrift in standard accounts of the Revolution, and the fact that so many Southern commanders were themselves slaveholders is an important consideration in accounts of the war written in our time. Here, as in almost everything in life, irony abounds. How is it, Samuel Johnson asked at the start of the war, that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of Negroes? And Johnson was referring not to Southerners only, but to Americans in general. Abigail Adams noticed this too, telling John, "It always seemed to me a most iniquitous scene to fight for ourselves for what we are robbing and plundering the Negroes of, who have as good a right to freedom as we have." Now, all this seems pretty obvious to us today, but Edmund Burke, from his March 1775 speech on conciliation with the colonies, my title is taken, saw something here that others of less penetrating intellect have failed to see. Burke noticed that the spirit of liberty was greater in the South than in the North, precisely because of the institution of slavery. In Virginia and the Carolinas, Burke said, they have a vast multitude of slaves. And where this is the case in any part of the world, those who are free are by far more proud and jealous of their freedom. Burke in no way intended, as he put it, to commend the superior morality of this sentiment, which has at least as much pride as virtue in it, but I cannot alter the nature of man. The fact is, Burke said, that these people of the Southern colonies are much more strongly and with a higher and stubborn spirit attached to liberty than those to the northward. In such a people, Burke said, the haughtiness of domination, combined with the spirit of freedom, fortifies it and renders it invincible. And as we have seen, invincible it proved to be. We may wish the sources of this spirit of freedom were other than they were, but wishing will not make it so. I mentioned the beating that Jefferson's reputation took even during the war, and as we now know, his reputation has taken an even bigger beating lately. The only leader whose reputation has remained intact, and rightfully so, I believe, was Washington. I mentioned Benedict Arnold earlier. Everybody always remembers Benedict Arnold and how Washington was so terribly mistaken in his assessment of Arnold's character. This is unfair, I came to believe, the more I learned about the war. It's unfair in this sense. Washington was, in fact, a remarkable judge of character, as the confidence he placed in men like Greene and Daniel Morgan demonstrate. Maybe Arnold is the exception that proves the rule, if that is what exceptions do. Now, indulge me here while I mentioned some of the reviews this fierce people has received and the response of the general public. I wrote it for the general public, after all, not for specialists or academic historians, as much respect as I have for them and what they do. So, I was especially gratified by this comment posted on Facebook by one of my own nephews, a resident of New Hope, Pennsylvania, which is, of course, about 10 miles north of Washington's Crossing. I don't know who Alan Crawford is, this nephew wrote. But I'm really hoping his Southern perspective on the American Revolution is full of high-speed car chases and fun songs with catchy banjo licks, or at least a good barbecue recipe. And now, I don't think this nephew was terribly disappointed, even if I did neglect to chronicle the little-known Battle of Mayberry and the heroic role played in it by the ancestors of Barney Fife. Now, I'll discuss all this with him over Thanksgiving. So I'm ready now to take any questions that you might have. I hope I don't disappoint with the extent to which I have to say the answer to a lot of questions I get is I don't know. I've told people before that I'm not a real historian, and people say, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, I don't teach. I don't have an area of specialty. I'm a generalist, comes from a journalistic background. And a different way of putting that is some people have an imposter complex. I don't. I'm an imposter. I spent much of my career in Washington, and a few years ago I heard from a political activist that I had not had any contact with for years. And out of the nowhere, I got this email from him, and he proceeded to engage me in an argument about politics. And he became very exasperated very quickly. And he said, finally, Alan, you are nothing but a foppish dabbler. And I said, John, the word you're looking for is dilettante. So with all those caveats, I'll be happy to answer. I will be happy to tell you I don't know. So any questions you might have.
Is foppish dabbler copyright? Can we put that on a t-shirt?
I need to put it on a sweatshirt or something, or a baseball cap. I like it, though. I'm glad he said that to me, as insulting as he intended it to be. Yes?
What else did you learn about Benedict Arnold? He's in my family line, and it'd be interesting to hear what all you found out about him.
Again, I'll tell you, I don't know. I know enough to know that that for money, he betrayed the American cause, and I also know that there are areas out east of Richmond that I like to go to, up near the Civil War battlefield at Malvern Hill, and that is where, as I recall, that is where Lafayette chased Arnold as they were all getting back to Yorktown in that period. Again, Arnold's a brilliant character and very interesting and rather tragic in a sense. And I think he's everybody's, what everybody points to as George Washington's great failure. And they assume that Washington was not a good judge of character, but I think, as I put it, he's the exception that proves the rule. He's a little like, what little I know about his character, which isn't much, he's a little like Aaron Burr. You know, he's one of these rather tragic figures that is very complicated. And if I were 30 years old, I'd put it on the to-do list to write a biography of him. But I don't have that much time. And so what's the family connection?
Just a lot of my relatives, I guess, were in the American Revolution and came over the Mayflower and all that. And so, anyway.
So were they related to Arnold?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, he's in our family tree.
Do you have a big portrait of him in your house?
No, we do not.
Probably a good idea.
I don't know. Maybe I should get one.
You should get one. Yes.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter really got me interested in what was going on in the South during the Revolution, and I got a kick out of how he made a novel out of it that used actual names and figures. And Thomas Brown, what a character, when they tarred and feathered him and just about cracked the skull open. And he went on to, I just wondered if you delved into any of the British headquarters down in St. Augustine, because we plan to go down there and take a trip.
No, again, I'm going to disappoint you because there are specialists who know they're really in the weeds on all this stuff, and I'm dependent upon them. So there's almost every book signing, and if this is the case today, I hope you don't think I'm discourage you from doing this, but people will come to the head of the line and they'll tell me how their great-great-great-grandfather fought at Guilford Courthouse or something, and they will expect me to know his story. and I was described this earlier over lunch as I'm kind of like a drone, looking at the big picture of things. But I'm dependent upon the people who actually do this archival research that would be able to tell you and nail it down in a way that I'm always at a loss.
Well, I'm still looking forward to reading your book.
Well, good.
I think you're selling yourself short. I don't think ABT gives out awards for drones. I'm just really done.
Well, thank you. That's very nice. I just don't want to oversell myself as an expert
Okay, go for it.
in which I'm a journalist and basically a generalist who finds stories he's really interested in. I mean, there are people, and I know some of them or have met some of them who will write 8 books on George Washington or Jefferson or something like that. And I have the tremendous respect and admiration for that. My attention span isn't that good. Yes.
So my question is a little bit more of what's your opinion on this? You know, Washington starts really focusing more on northern campaigns than he does what he could have in the South. And, you know, we tend to study more of the northern
You're right.
portions of the revolution than we do the South. So,
Sure.
why do you think, you know, Washington becomes more focused on, you know, regaining New York and all this when he could have made some moves in the South? And why do you think that those southern campaigns are less studied?
I think there are a couple of things. One is that I believe the earliest histories of the war are in biographies of George Washington. So the war is viewed in his shadow, in a sense, as a reflection of what he did. That's part of it. Another part of it is that some of the early histories are written out of New York and Massachusetts. And so there is that a bias, and I use the term bias non-critically, but there is that brought to bear on it. And I think that Washington genuinely believed that he would have a cataclysmic battle with the British in New York that would end the war. So he's in a holding pattern there for something that never happens. And the British, meanwhile, I think rather intelligently, decide this is a stalemate. Let's shift our attentions elsewhere. And again, with the belief that there are Tories in the South, which there were. I think one of the great episodes of the war is when Greene leads what's referred to as the race to the Dan River, which separates North Carolina and South Carolina. And he leads what looks like a retreat. He leads the Continental Army in the South through the Carolinas up into Virginia. Meanwhile, the British are chasing him, which takes them farther and farther away, not only from the coast where they can be resupplied, but their own supply depots. So they get farther and farther and farther away, and their supplies are diminishing, and their manpower is diminishing. And what looks like a kind of retreat is actually a kind of battle. And then the British don't even cross the Dan River. They basically give up. Washington, Greene resupplies his men. They rest up in the area of South Boston, Virginia, and then they go back south. So it's a very interesting episode. I think you'll find it gripping reading. Yeah.
You mentioned the race to the Dan. And,
Yeah.
Talk about a concept of deception and cow pens I noticed there was something similar at Guilford Courthouse when you had the North Carolina line and the Virginia.
Yeah.
And then the Continentals, and they bring it back to the 6-pounders back there. Do you notice that just idea of deception and kind of using the haughtiness of the enemy against them, does that seem to be a common thread in this?
Well, I think it's a recognition of reality. And it's Green at Guilford Courthouse, I believe. He's learned from Morgan. He's trying to do what Morgan did at Cowpens and does it less effectively. But I think that what you see is a recognition of reality and a pragmatic response to it. So that's why you have people like Francis Marion, who are engaged in hit and run tactics, wearing down the British will and the British resources. When they have to fight a battle of a war of attrition, I think was Green's word. I can't remember exactly, but I think Green said, this is, we don't have the resources to engage them as Washington wanted to do in New York. So we're going to have to hit them and then run away. And I think Green said that the most important thing he could do was keep an army in the field. And so you had this pragmatic recognition of the realities and what are we going to do? And as Washington told Green, you're going to have to figure this out, which I think is just great on Washington. It made me admire Washington all the more than if he'd had his battle with the British and won the war up there. The fact that he knew he could put these people in command and say, you figure it out, I trust your judgment. And they did it. I think that's just fantastic. I love these people. I even liked Tarleton as a character.
I didn't know if you were looking at a question up there. Obviously, Cornwallis is bringing a British army into this theater, composed of all sorts of different members of the Scottish, Irish, British peoples, but also Hessians,
Right.
German mercenaries, and that alone introduces a whole new element into this region where, as you said, there's been going on and will go on a civil war amongst the populace between the patriots and the loyalists. Can you give a sense of how many loyalists came and joined in with Cornwallis in this fight? Did his ranks grow very much to any significant way by the addition of loyalists? And were there any, there were other continental troops, weren't there, that came in?
Sure, as I mentioned, the Over Mountain Men, and then there were all, I have a cousin who's a military historian in Lexington, Kentucky. Writes mainly on the Civil War. He has a book on Meade at Gettysburg that's done very well. And I called him once and I said, Kent, I can't keep all these units separate. I can't figure out, this is the 59th whatever of Rhode Island or something. And his response was, don't even try. In part because the reader doesn't really care. And the nature of the war in the South, those troops interpenetrated constantly. So there would be, at a battle, there would be Continental soldiers, there would be state militia, and then there would be independents like those following Francis Marion, who weren't really affiliated with anybody. And some of these are locals. So you had the farther, I don't know about troop strength, but the farther you got into the backcountry was when you would have unaffiliated loyalists shooting up their in-laws and vice versa, and burning each other's barns and churches. And so in terms of numbers, again, I have to plead ignorance. But it's a huge issue. And I have a good friend who wrote a book both on enslaved people, American Indians, and loyalists. Three Kings, Three Peoples, I believe it's called, by Jim Pikich. That's probably he's probably the expert on that question. So you need to get him in here.
3 groups that had to figure out who to bet on.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily bet right.
No. No.
Well, please join me in welcoming, or thank you.